So what we're going to do now is we're just going to have a look at a couple of different types of amplifiers. So just so you can get a bit of a comparison, have a listen to the different sounds. So there's a Marshall JCM 800 from the 1980s, which is a valve amp, tube amp. There's a Fender Hot Rod Deluxe, which in fact is no more. It's been completely modded by a local amplifier builder here close to me in the UK, and it's now much closer to a old Fender Bassman design. And then just for a bit of comparison, we're going to be looking at a couple of transistor or solid state amps. So there's a much more modern recent amp. It's a Marshall. It's basically like a practice amp. So that is solid state stroke. There'll be some digital effects, digital modeling on it. And then there's also an older transistor solid state amp, a Fender one from the 1980s, which is actually quite good quality, but you hopefully be able to hear the basic differences in tone you get, and probably you'll be able to hear why most professional players actually much prefer to use like tube amps, like particularly for recording, you know, where you can really hear the detail of the sound. So we'll go straight over to the Marshall. Okay, so here is another amplifier. This is it's a combo, which means that the amplifier and the speaker are all in the same cabinet, and it's a JCM 800 from the mid-1980s. You can kind of think of the vast majority of amplifiers in terms of whether they are more like a Marshall or whether they are more like a Fender. Now there's various things, you know, to do with the sort of the wiring and the components used and the rest of it, but people normally talk about the power amp valves as being quite a sort of classic in relation to the sort of character of each amp. It's a good sort of indication. So Marshalls use EL34 power amp valves or tubes, whereas Fenders use 6L6 valves or tubes. And one of the main differences is that the EL34s, they kind of overdrive. They have more of a sort of mid-range character, and they use more power, and they run hotter. And they overdrive more easily. This is a 1980s amp. Now straight away, all of the EQs on flat. This is the clean channel. So you can probably hear that that's quite bright in comparison. It's quite loud, this. It doesn't have any power scaling, unlike the other one. So I've got the volume. This is the master volume. This is the preamp for the clean channel. You can see that's very, very low there. So if and say I'm just going to switch over, it's foot switchable. I'm just going to switch over to the gain channel, which is all of this. You probably hear a classic like Marshall sound. Okay, so what the main difference here is this just has a gain, but this whole channel has a master volume, and it has a gain. So this gain's quite high here. That is determining the amount of distortion. It also increases the volume, but I can control the volume with this one here. So that's pretty raspy. Okay, so you can probably hear that has got a very 1980s sound. It's quite sort of raspy, it's quite harsh, you know, because that's what they liked in those days. So if I actually turn some treble off and maybe just put a little bit more bass on. See what this does. I'm going to turn this gain down a little bit as well. So it's a bit more classic rock, not too full on. So a little bit warmer, but the typical sound you get from the sort of Marshall sound EL84s is, you know, it's great if you want to play, you know, with some distortion, with some sort of natural gain, you know, if you're not so interested in clean tones. Okay, next on the list we have a Fender. So this just looks like a standard Hot Rod Deluxe. It's pretty good. I did loads of gigs with this, the original, but I've actually had it modded by a chap called Dave Gascoigne of Rosewell Amps, and it's completely gutted, and he's rebuilt it so it's much more like an authentic Fender Bassman sort of tweed amp sound. So these use output valves which are 6L6, so they're a little bit different to the EL84s. There's more what you call headroom. They can like cope with more power before they just start to distort, which is why people typically associate sort of Fender sounds with being more clean and Marshall as being more distorted. I mean, it's a combination of the pre and the power amp stages, but you can typically think of it in those ways. All right, so this is the top of the amp. It's just the standard layout, sort of control layout from the original Hot Rod. So there's two channel inputs here, so we just plugged into one, and so the preamp for channel 1 is this volume 1, and then if we plugged into channel 2, they're parallel inputs, so they only work together if you have what you call an AB switch, which we'll look at in the effects video. So drive, this is actually just the preamp for channel 2, so we don't need it at the minute. Some amps have a bright setting, which just gives you more top end, more sort of presence, more high frequency. We've just got 3 band EQ on this. One of the main differences here, we've actually got a master volume. Now I was asking him about power scaling or like attenuation on the output, so it could be used for home use, because your typical Fender style amps, like we said, if we want distortion, we've just got to turn up the preamp a lot, which becomes a bit of a nightmare if you're not playing a loud gig. So we've got a master volume here, so it's actually going to behave a little bit more like a Marshall. If I turn this down, turn up the gain, we've got a nice amount of distortion here. We'll turn this down a little bit, so we've got not a huge amount of breakup. Turn this up slightly. Can hear again, same trick. Great as a what you call a pedal platform amplifier, where you know we can use gain and drive pedals which work with this, but it's all flat, and again, you know, you can just adjust a bit of top end. We're still on the bridge pickup. Might take a little bit of bass off because it's quite full on. Boost the mid a tiny little bit as well. And then got a nice reverb, quite big, sort of long tail on it. So it's less aggressive. It doesn't have that sort of 1980s style bite to it in the same way as the Marshall does. There's a bit of brightness to it, the bright switch. Typically gives you more glassy. More glassy sound. The only other thing to consider is true valve amps sound different depending on how loud you've got the power amp section. If we're playing it like 2 or 3, it's actually going to sound quite different to if we're playing it like you know, sort of 6 or 7. It really kind of opens up. You get a different character to them. So if you're mostly a home player, something like a 40 watt is far too loud. You know, 5 watt. I've got a student who's bought a Vox AC15. That actually sounds quite good. You know, that's okay. Okay, so this is the back of the Fender, the Bassman mod. So just a quick one. Basically, if you're ever unsure as to whether your amp is a valve amp, have a look at the back and you can literally see the valves. Simple as that. If it's not, if it's a solid state, it'll just be completely closed off. And you know, because we have to expose them because they get hot. You can't keep them in a chamber. So very quickly, on this particular one, 2 power amp valves. This third one is the power rectifier valve. Here we have the 2 preamp valves. So these are actually in little protective enclosures. And then this is the valve for the reverb. So all 3 of those amps so far might be a little bit on the expensive side if you know, you're not a sort of serious gigging musician, if you're more of like a home enthusiast. So this is another valve amp, but this is definitely much more of a practice amp. It's only actually 5 watts. So it's good for home playing. Now it's relatively inexpensive, this one. So you're looking at somewhere slightly over between 100 and 200 English pounds, US dollars, that kind of thing. And it's the same idea. We've got the preamp gain. We've just got a single tone. This is the power amp level, the volume, and then we've got a bit of reverb here, which I'll turn on in a minute. Now this one also has power scaling for home use. It's just around the back, if I can find it. So this is turned down to 0.1 watt. So if I turn that up full, it's actually quite quiet there. Now the benefit of that is, if you want some gain, still quite loud there. We've got a bit of gain, but it's just about manageable for home use. Now this sounds quite boxy. It's a small box. It sounds quite boxy. You know, it's much more kind of inexpensive compared to the others. It's still fine. It's still good. I've actually gigged with this before. So I'm going to put a little bit of treble on it, just turn that up. I'm going to turn this back round. I'm going to put it back onto full 5 watt mode. So as soon as you turn the preamp gain down, the whole output level drops a bit, so you've got a balance as with the others. Just give it a little bit more top, just because it's quite boxy compared to the others. Here's a little bit of reverb. Something like this is a good option for home use, because again you can really control the output level, the volume, and it still sounds quite authentic. It's a proper valve. It has a EL34 as the output, and as with all the others, it has a 12 AX7 as the preamp valve. So just one of each because it's a small amp. Alright, so this is the first solid state amp. Now it's actually quite a decent quality amp this. It's from the early to mid 1980s, I think. It's 100 watt, made in the USA, but it's solid state. It's actually quite loud. I'm going to have to to have to play this reasonably quietly because this clean channel is on absolute minimum. It goes from nothing to loud in a, you know, quite sort of harsh step. But I've set all of the EQ flat just so you can have a basic listen. Now probably straight away you might notice how it's a little bit brighter. Okay. Now on its own, just playing purely through the amp and no effects, no pedals, particularly gain pedals, which we'll look at in more detail in another video, it actually sounds quite nice. Sometimes you can get the impression that a solid state amp has more sort of high fidelity than a valve. It sounds brighter. It actually has a higher frequency range. Like valve amps generally don't pump out as many sort of high mid range frequencies. Clean, certainly it works. It works quite nicely. It works quite nicely. That's all completely flat. If I thought it would require sort of dulling down slightly, I'll just roll the treble off. I might pump the mid slightly, leave the bass, see what that sounds like. A bit more mellow, a bit softer. Generally, anything over about 30 watts these days will come with an optional foot switch. This one comes with a foot switch, but I'm just going to use this button for the time being. So, often with bigger amps, like the Marshall, you'll have like a separate EQ for each channel. So, this has got volume, and then the gain is like the preamp. But it's kind of working in a slightly different way. It's almost just turning up the effect as opposed to actually driving the preamp in the same way as you would normally get in a valve, a tube amp. So again, it's 100 watt. I've got this pretty low, EQ set straight. So turn the gain up. So you get reasonably authentic sort of hard rock sound there. Again, might take a little bit of treble off. Body is effectively mid-range. Let's pump that a little bit. Not quite so much gain. So quiet volumes, you know, because this, I mean, it's quite loud, but I've got it on the actual volumes are very, very minimal here. It doesn't sound too bad. It's, you know, it sounds quite bright. You might even think it sounds slightly preferable on this video, but turning it right up, you know, so you kind of competing volume-wise with say a drummer, you know, a decent drummer who knows how to hit the drums correctly, then it's going to start to sound quite harsh, quite just the high mid-range may well just be a little bit too unpleasant. Valve amps have a bit more warmth. They have a much more contained frequency range. Which basically means they don't sound so harsh when you play them loud, or in particular when you overdrive them. Like the distortion from a valve amp generally is much, it doesn't have the same high mids, and it doesn't sound harsh. It can actually sound quite painful almost listening to a really loud transistor amp. Okay, so here is the final amp we're going to have a look at today. This is much more modern. This is maybe 2 or 3 kind of models below the current ones available from Marshall, which are effectively practice amps. It's a 30 watt. You know, you can go right down to 10 watt for practice amps, solid state, and it effectively uses digital effects. So the previous one was 100, this one's 30. They're both solid state. Now, the 5-watt Bagheera is arguably louder than this. It's partly to do with the fact that valve amps, tube amps, use what you call soft clipping, so there's more sort of compression when you start to overdrive them. It doesn't sound as harsh, so you can turn it up louder and it doesn't make your ears bleed, basically. And there's a couple of other things as well. It's not necessarily a true 30-watt amp. Now, this is perfectly good for practice playing at home. I use this for teaching on when I do like face-to-face lessons. Works perfectly well, but I'd never personally gig with it. So with slightly, more inexpensive, slightly cheaper amps, they won't necessarily use the best components, and so there might actually be, some signal loss. You might be restricting from being able to utilize the entire potential output, 30 watts. And because of the hard clipping that occurs in solid state amps, you can't necessarily, turn them up so loud. If you get to, 8 or 9 on a master volume and you've got distortion again, it's just very, very unpleasant in comparison to a valve amp, which you can sometimes, turn up almost full and it's really driving, but it still sounds all right. So this is quite flat. This is the clean sound. So again, sounds all right, clean. So, that sounds nice. Pretty quiet, this. I certainly couldn't, play along with many other people unless it was a quiet, sort of guitar jam, but it sounds quite nice at this volume. Now, it is foot switchable. This, you have to buy them separately, but this allows me to use like a different range of tones from it. Because it's a digital amp, I have to actually reset these whenever I change it. So I'm going to put this onto some overdrive, but what I need to do is I need to remind it to reset to all of these values here. So I just need to give all of these a little wiggle and get rid of the reverb. There's the volume, there's the volume, and that's reset. So that's all completely flat. So the gain now is really cranking, because it's not really proper distortion. It's like an effect. It's like a recreation, a reproduction of the sort of valve sound you get from the distortion sound you get from a valve tube amp. So let's see if we can make it sound a little bit better. Okay, so there's the distortion setting. Let's maybe add a little bit more bass and middle, take a bit of treble off because it is sounding quite sharp. Just one speaker in here, quite a small one as well. The quality of the speaker can really affect the overall sound as well. And again, at low levels, it doesn't sound too bad. Like I said, I wouldn't gig with it, because if I this master's on 9 o'clock. If I turn right up, I'm not going to play this because I'll clip the recording equipment. But if I was to turn this right up, it would just start to sound very harsh. I'm going to go back to clean a minute. Now I just need to reset all of these again, just to remind the sort of digital controls where they're at. Okay, reverb, it's not too bad. Now, as with a lot of cheaper amps, you turn up the reverb to a certain point and then it actually flips over to a different one. So it gives you a spring. and I think that will give you a hall. So this second one is more like what you would normally get in the back of an amp. It's not too bad. And again, because it's a digital amp, we can put effects on as well, and these sort of scroll through some different options. So that's a bit of chorus. It's a sort of swooshy phaser sound. So that's about it. I hope you enjoyed this video. So basically, a lot of the time it's to do with, personal choice really, sort of styles of music you like to play, and maybe, the sounds of like sort of well-known guitarists and bands, like which ones you prefer. So, people typically associate Marshall with, rock, classic rock, heavy rock, that kind of thing. Fender can have a sort of more cleaner, sort of sweeter sound. A lot of blues playing might be more associated with like a tweed amp sound, which again is Fender, but it's like an earlier model. So similar to that Roswell mod that I showed you before in the Fender Hot Rod case. While solid state transistor amps can actually be really good to just practice on, because you can have them at low level and it won't like affect the sound. It'll be sort of consistent sound regardless of what the volume output is. You can probably hear why, if you really turn them up, they're not really ideal for gigs, for sort of live playing where we've particularly got high volumes. You're gonna scare the audience basically. They probably won't like the sort of harshness of tone. But yeah, that's about it. And so I hope you enjoyed this video. Yeah, please consider leaving a tip. Go to the website, codertuition.com, if you want to download any of our scores, and we'll be back for the final lesson in the series very soon, which will be looking at effects and maybe how they relate to amplifiers as well. Okay, so we'll see you here again soon on Coder Guitar.